The night Bob Dylan stopped playing was not supposed to matter to anyone except the people in the room. But years later, those who were there would say the moment rewired something inside them, because legends aren't meant to freeze mid-song, and gratitude isn't supposed to glow in the dark. The arena lights were already dimmed when Dylan walked onto the stage that night. No announcement, no dramatic build-up, just a ripple of recognition moving through 18,000 people who knew better than to scream his name. This was a charity concert, the kind filled with polite applause and unspoken rules, the kind where donors sipped wine in private boxes and the artist did as said, nodded once, and disappeared. Dylan liked it that way. He was older now, leaner, quieter, his voice worn into something rough but honest, like driftwood shaped by decades of storms. He adjusted the mic, nodded to the band, and started with a song nobody expected, one of the deep ones, not a hit. Not something radio ever loved, but something true. The crowd leaned in. Phone stayed down. This was Dylan territory, where reverence replaced noise. He played steadily, fingers moving with muscle memory older than most of the audience, his mind half somewhere else, as it often was. Then, halfway through the second verse, something flickered in the darkness. Not a camera flash, not a phone, a soft glow, low and steady, pulsing like a heartbeat. Dylan's eyes caught it by accident, the way you notice a candle in a dark church without meaning to. He kept playing, but his gaze drifted back again, drawn by instinct. The glow was coming from the lower balcony, front row, slightly off-center. A rectangle of light, shaking just enough to suggest human hands. Dylan missed a chord, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the band to glance at him. He recovered immediately, but his attention was gone. The glow brightened. Words emerged. Handwritten. Uneven. Dylan leaned closer to the mic without realizing it, his voice dropping, stretching syllables as he tried to read while playing. The words resolved slowly, painfully, like a confession surfacing from water. I survived cancer because your music kept me here. Thank you. Dylan stopped. He didn't mean to. His right hand simply didn't come down for the next strum. The sound died mid-breath, leaving a silence so sudden it felt physical, like pressure popping in ears. 18,000 people froze, unsure whether to clap, cheer, or wait. The band stilled, eyes locked on Dylan. He stood there, guitar hanging against his chest, staring at the glowing sign as if it were the only solid thing in the room. He had read thousands of signs in his life, political ones, protest ones demanding songs, ones demanding explanations, but this was different. This one wasn't asking for anything. It wasn't demanding meaning. It was offering it back. Dylan squinted, not because he couldn't read it, but because he could, and because reading it forced him to do something he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Connect a song to a single, specific life. He saw the man holding it then, not clearly at first, just the outline. Mid-40s, maybe older. Thin. Shoulders slightly hunched, like someone who had learned how to make himself small in hospital rooms. The glow illuminated his face just enough to reveal scars at the neck. The faint shine of tears he wasn't wiping away. The man wasn't waving the sign. He wasn't trying to be seen. He was just holding it, hands trembling, as if afraid the moment would disappear if he moved. Dylan's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't spoken to an audience in years unless absolutely necessary. He believed songs said enough. But now the songs had said something he hadn't expected, and the room was waiting for him to answer. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the upper tiers, someone sniffed. Another person whispered, "Oh my God," not loudly, but with the kind of awe usually reserved for disasters narrowly avoided. Dylan shifted his weight. He looked down at his guitar, then back up at the man with the sign. His mind, always restless, flicked backward through time. Hotel rooms, tour buses, late-night writing sessions where he'd scribbled lines he didn't fully understand yet. Songs born out of confusion, anger, loneliness. He had never written for survival. He had written because he didn't know how not to. The idea that those words had sat beside and forepole, that they had filled the silence of chemotherapy rooms, unsettled him. Dylan cleared his throat. The sound echoed, magnified, fragile. He leaned toward the microphone, then hesitated, stepping back instead, as if the mic suddenly felt like a barrier. He raised one hand. Not a wave, not a greeting, just an instinctive gesture toward the glowing sign. The house lights began to rise slowly, revealing faces streaked with tears, mouths parted, people realizing collectively that this was no longer a performance. Dylan spoke, but not into the mic. His voice was low, almost private, carried only because the room was holding its breath. You want to tell me your name? The man flinched, stunned, as if he hadn't considered the possibility of being answered. He lowered the sign slightly, the glow dimming, and opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Dylan lifted a hand again, gently. Hold on, he said. Let me see you. The lights came up another notch. The sign dropped fully now, its message burned into memory, no longer needing light. The man stood slowly, legs unsteady, and the entire arena seemed to rise with him in spirit. Dylan nodded once, a small, solemn motion that looked almost like recognition. He turned back toward the band, fingers brushing the strings without playing, and for the first time that night, he looked unsure of what came next. No one knew then that this pause, this frozen second suspended between song and silence, would become the most talked about moment of the concert, the moment people would replay in their minds for years, the moment that would leave 18,000 strangers crying not because of what Dylan's saying, but because of what he finally stopped long enough to hear. What most people remember is the silence, but what mattered was what filled it, because as Dylan stood there, fingers resting uselessly on the strings, his mind began doing something it almost never did during a show. It started building a story around a stranger. He watched the man in the balcony like a lyric slowly revealing itself, noticing details that felt uncomfortably intimate. The way his shoulders were set too carefully, like someone guarding against pain that might return at any moment. The way his smile trembled between gratitude and disbelief, as if he still wasn't convinced he was allowed to be alive, let alone noticed. The man finally spoke his name into the cavernous quiet, voice thin but steady, and Dylan caught only fragments at first, not because he couldn't hear, but because the words landed heavier than sound. The crowd leaned forward as one organism as the man explained, haltingly, that 5 years earlier he'd been given a prognosis that came with a look instead of a timeline, that special expression doctors wore when they didn't want to lie, but couldn't tell the truth either. He talked about the hospital room that never fully went dark, about the machines that beeped like metronomes marking time he wasn't sure he still had, about nights when sleep refused to come because fear was louder than pain. Dylan listened without moving, eyes fixed, face unreadable, but inside something tightened, because the man wasn't talking about bravery or miracles or faith. He was talking about boredom, despair, and the grinding monotony of surviving. Then he mentioned the music. Not Dylan's name at first, just the songs, the ones that didn't promise happy endings, the ones that didn't pretend everything would be okay. He said those were the songs that stayed with him when friends stopped visiting, when family didn't know what to say anymore, when hope felt like an obligation he couldn't afford. Dylan felt a faint, unwelcome heat behind his eyes. He'd spent decades being accused of cynicism, of refusing comfort, and here was a man saying that refusal had been the comfort. The man explained how one song, he named it quietly, almost apologetically, had become something like a companion, played through cheap headphones during chemo sessions, replayed during long drives home, where the world felt unchanged and unbearably indifferent. He said he didn't always understand the lyrics, but he understood the voice, the way it sounded like someone who wasn't pretending to have answers. That, he said, made it easier to stay. Not hopeful, just here. Dylan swallowed. He had written that song in a rented room decades earlier, annoyed with himself, convinced it was too bleak, almost left it unfinished. He remembered thinking no one would care. He remembered being wrong about many things, but never like this. Around them, people were crying openly now, grown men wiping their faces with sleeves, women clutching strangers' hands, because the story had escaped the stage and landed somewhere personal. Dylan noticed the band members too, standing frozen, instruments hanging uselessly, their faces soft and stunned. He realized with a quiet jolt that this was the first time in years he hadn't felt like the oldest person in the room. He felt suddenly young and unprepared. The man finished speaking and looked down, embarrassed by the attention, as if he'd said too much. "I didn't come to interrupt," he added quickly. I wanted you to know." Dylan nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, grounding. He stepped fully to the microphone now, but when he spoke, his voice was different, lower, stripped of its usual distance. "You didn't interrupt," he said. "You finished something." A ripple moved through the audience, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. Dylan paused, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing something fragile. He admitted, quietly, that he never knew where songs went once they left him, that he'd always believed they belonged to whoever needed them. But hearing where this one had gone made his chest feel strange, like a room he hadn't opened in a long time. He glanced back at the man. "You said you survived?" Dylan said. The man nodded. "Yeah, I did." Dylan held that word, survived, like a chord, testing its weight. "Then you did the hard part," he said. "The song just kept you company." The man shook his head, tears spilling freely now. "Sometimes," he said, "company is the difference." Dylan didn't argue. He knew better than most that words failed where presence didn't. He turned slightly, away from the mic, and took a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, almost like grief. For years he'd avoided these moments, avoided personalization, avoided becoming a symbol that had to answer back. But something about the way the man had said thank you, without expectation, without demand, made avoidance feel dishonest. Dylan looked out at the sea of faces, 18,000 witnesses to something unscripted and irretrievable. "I don't usually do this," he said, and the understatement drew a fragile smile through the crowd. "But since we're here," he turned back to the band, naming the song the man had mentioned, a deep cut buried in the catalog, one that rarely made set lists anymore. The band exchanged quick looks, surprised but ready. Dylan adjusted his guitar strap, fingers finding the opening chord slowly, reverently, as if he were asking permission from the instrument itself. Before he played, he glanced once more at the man in the balcony, who nodded through tears, hands clasped together now that the sign was gone, as if in prayer or gratitude or both. The first notes rang out softer than before, tentative, carrying a vulnerability the song hadn't had in decades. Dylan sang differently now, not performing, not projecting, but offering. The lyrics landed like confessions rather than declarations, each line shaped by the knowledge that someone in the room had once leaned on them to stay alive. The audience didn't breathe. The song moved through the space slowly, deliberately, and as Dylan reached the final verse, his voice wavered, not breaking, but bending, acknowledging weight instead of resisting it. When the last note faded, it didn't vanish into applause. It dissolved into quiet, into something like reverence. Dylan lowered his head, eyes closed, holding the silence for one more beat before lifting his gaze back to the balcony. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply tipped his head once, a small, unmistakable gesture of recognition. And in that instant, the room understood that this wasn't about celebrity or survival or even music anymore. It was about two people who had never met, connected by a song neither of them had fully understood until now. The applause came late, like people were afraid of damaging something fragile, and when it finally arrived it wasn't loud at first, just a swelling wave of sound built from sobs, gasps, and hands coming together almost apologetically, until 18,000 people were standing without realizing when they'd risen. Dylan remained where he was, head slightly bowed, letting the noise wash over him without feeding it, without turning the moment into spectacle. He waited until the clapping softened again, until the room remembered how to be quiet, and only then did he step back to the microphone. That's enough," he said, not sharply, but gently, as if drawing a boundary around something sacred. He didn't explain. He didn't summarize what had just happened. He didn't thank the crowd. Instead, he looked once more toward the balcony, toward the man who had lowered his sign and was now holding his face in his hands, shoulders shaking, alive in a way that felt almost new. Dylan nodded to him again, slower this time, and then, with the smallest shrug, he turned back to the band and said, "Let's finish the night." The rest of the set passed in a kind of shared trance. Dylan played, the band followed, and the audience listened differently now, every lyric carrying an extra layer of weight, every pause filled with memory. No one shouted for requests. No one raised a phone. It was as if the room had collectively agreed to protect what had happened by not intruding on it. When the final song ended, Dylan did an encore. He simply set his guitar down carefully, stepped back, and walked offstage without looking behind him. Backstage, he declined interviews, ignored producers, and sat alone for several minutes in a folding chair, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. A stage manager hovered nervously, then retreated. Dylan eventually stood, took a deep breath, and left through a side exit, slipping into the night unnoticed, as he preferred. The man from the balcony never met him. There were no photos together, no autographs, no handshake for the cameras. He didn't need one. He left the arena quietly, surrounded by strangers who smiled at him like they shared a secret. And for the first time since his diagnosis, he didn't feel like a survivor. He felt like a person again. In the days that followed, word of the moment spread, not through press releases or headlines, but through shaky phone videos, long social media posts written at 3 in the morning, and conversations that began with, "I was there." People didn't talk about Dylan's voice or the setlist. They talked about the pause, the sighing, the way a legend had stopped being untouchable for one unguarded minute. Dylan never addressed it publicly. When asked months later about the concert, he brushed it off with a half smile and said, "Sometimes a song comes back to you." But those who were there knew the truth was heavier than that. A man had said thank you without asking for anything in return, and Dylan, who had spent a lifetime keeping the world at arm's length, had listened. Somewhere between the glow of a handmade sign and the silence of 18,000 people, something closed a circle that had been open for decades. And long after the lights went out and the stage was cleared, the story lingered, not as proof of fame or miracle, but as a reminder that words matter most when they find someone who needs them, and that sometimes the greatest thing an artist can do is stop playing long enough to hear what came back.